is the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by James Kirchick. He is a visiting fellow of the Brookings Institute, a columnist for Tablet magazine, and one of the most talented and deep-thinking columnists or writers, quite frankly, that I've come across, I think. Jamie, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you for that very flattering introduction.
No, I mean it sincerely, especially in today's times where you have such like BS clickbait that's like 3 paragraphs long. You really get deep into these issues. I was thinking we could start off. So much of your writings focus on the attacks or dismantling of liberalism and traditionally liberal institutions in the West, particularly the U.S. And when we're talking for the audience, when we're talking about liberalism, we mean it in the classical philosophical sense, a true meaning of the word. So people believe strongly in individual rights and freedom of speech, due process, economic freedoms. And so when we go back to say, like, we don't have to go back this far, but as an example, say like the JFK era, people who were on the political left or identified with it, a lot of those people were strong liberals, right? They were like the kind of dying breed, but like the Alan Dershowitzes, the Glenn Greenwalds, Bill Maher, maybe even Chappelle fits into this category.
I don't know if I would include Glenn Greenwald in that, but he's a whole, he's a whole nother kettle of fish. We don't have to talk about him today.
Okay,
or maybe we do. I don't
know. We could get a little bit into it. In terms of our definition of what liberalism traditionally on the left has been. And obviously, notably, the ACLU probably under Ira Glaser, which we'll get into. And so, like I said, these people are kind of like a dying breed now on the left. And my assessment, and I would like you to sort of respond to it, tell me if you agree or disagree and what your assessment is. But so you have the woke, the sort of illiberal left, the diversity, inclusion, equity left has largely taken over the political left. They have the momentum, they have the energy, they even have a lot of the power. I think even this sort of Chappelle Netflix episode illustrates that, where Netflix is now apologizing. So first of all, I want your sort of assessment of that. What do you think has happened to traditional liberalism? Traditional liberal institutions in this country, how are they being undermined by this sort of diversity, equity, inclusion branch? And maybe we can, like we said, like use the ACLU as an example, because they really are an archetype of this phenomenon, I think.
Well, it seems to me that liberalism, as you've defined it, in terms of individual rights and due process, freedom of speech and expression, in many of these places is being overtaken or overwhelmed almost by a form of Marxism. But it's not a class-based Marxism, it's a Marxism of identity. And so the woke left has replaced sort of the class struggle, which I think actually, I'm not a Marxist, but we can talk about this later. I do think that the Marxist analysis, or at least the appreciation for materialist understanding of a society, has a lot more going for it than the identitarian one, which is what this sort of new Marxist identitarianism has now taken over, where we now have sort of an identity struggle, and it's groups sort of warring against each other. And so whereas the left in this country, and certainly I'm saying the 20th century, really, I mean, the left was founded. If you think of, what is the left when we think about the left, it's about class. That's what it was about class, and it was for the 20th century in Western countries, left-wing parties, whether it was Social Democrats in Europe or the Labour Party or the Democratic Party. It was largely based on class, the working class. And it was multiracial in that sense.
Right.
And now we're in a new era when there is less and less appreciation for class as a determining factor in life and in society. And it's been replaced by identity. And so the new proletariat, you could say, is sort of, the non-white population, at least in this
Right.
interpretation.
So Oprah would almost be in the proletariat class.
By this definition, yes.
Yeah.
Your class does not matter. And that also, I think, explains the disdain that you hear from so many of these pseudo leftists. I think they're actually portraying left-wing ideals. And this is why you hear them express such contempt for, poor white people, who they should be trying to make appeals to based on their own economic ideology. And they could actually build a winning coalition, by the way, if they did. I do think that there is a large, and I know you're more libertarian, but if there was a political party in this country, or if the Democrats just sort of dispense with all the woke identity stuff and ran on a purely sort of economic populist nationalist platform, I think they'd be a winning party for the next couple of decades. There's a clear majority for that. But they've been taken over by this sort of cultural elite that's bred in the universities, elite media, the nonprofit world, entertainment, which is actually a small portion of the population, but they have almost a monopoly on cultural power. And one of this sort of weird things, and this actually, to get back to Glenn Greenwald, funnily enough, but over the past 2 years or so, since this cultural revolution began, I found myself appreciating and reading writers on the left who I never really had much time for before. People like Glenn Greenwald, who I still disagree with fervently. You can't see it, but one of the pictures in the frame behind me is the cover story I wrote for Commentary magazine in 2013, after the Snowden revelations, in which Mr. Greenwald played a crucial role. That cover story I wrote for Commentary attacking Greenwald and another far left journalist. So, I'm just prefacing what I'm about to say, which is that I've actually come to appreciate writers like Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, a guy named Freddie DeBoer. I don't know if you're familiar with him, who's a socialist, also on Substack. John Judas, who was a colleague of mine years ago at the New Republic magazine, who's also a socialist. A lot of these sort of old school socialist or social democrat writers, they have a more class-based understanding of society. And I might not agree with their prescriptions. I might not support socialist economic policies, but I do agree with them that your class is a much greater determinant of how you will fare in American society than any other factor. Your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. If you are born poor in this country, you will have a much more difficult life than if you are born middle class or working class. And I think that's indisputable, but you can't really make those arguments in a lot of these elite institutions. And, I think one of the best critiques of the 1619 Project I read on the World Socialist Workers website, because they were basically arguing this 1619 Project and all that goes with it is basically a kind of neoliberal attempt to distract the workers from their class interest. It's dividing everyone by race when we should be appealing to everyone by class.
And in fact, can I just interject?
Again, I might not. I don't. Sorry.
I would just like to interject real quick with the 1619 bit, because it's very interesting you mentioned that. So it's been reported. So right after the sort of Trump-Russia collusion stuff narrative wasn't going to fly anymore after the Mueller report, they deliberately went to focusing on race, and they came up with the 1619 Project to sort of center the new narrative around.
I mean, I think the 1619 Project was in development for a long time before that, but yes, there was this, and I've written about this, there was this sort of, internal meeting at the New York Times where the editor basically said what you said, that the Russiagate story had sort of run its course, and now the next, narrative we're going to focus on is race in America. And he was attacked, I think, by some of his own reporters who were saying we're not doing enough on race, that everything is about race. Every science story, every art story should be about race. So I think this is a large part of it, and I don't really consider myself a man of the left, so I'm kind of a centrist. So, and I'm not really of any kind of political persuasion. But if you're watching what's going on at the left right now, I think it's very clear, and you see the people who are sort of outcasts on the left are those who, like Bernie Sanders, are trying or have tried to put the emphasis on class. I think Sanders has basically been neutered on this. He's basically come around to the woke viewpoint.
That's right.
And it's sort of interesting because this is a guy who's very stubborn and has spent, whatever you want to say about him, he kind of sticks to his script, and he'd been doing that for decades. And by the way, not to the exclusion of racial issues. I mean, this was a guy who was arrested in civil rights protests in the 1960s. The notion that he is, in any way a racist is absurd.
Right.
And I think the argument that he would make, and I would actually agree with him on this, is that his policies, or at least the socialist policies, or the broad-based economic policies, maybe not even socialist, the broad-based economic policies will benefit the greater mass of people equally. And by the way, they will disproportionately benefit African Americans and people of color because they are disproportionately poorer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very strange way in which this debate has been framed, in which I think you have basically white progressives, upper middle class white progressives are the ones who have become extremely left wing, more left wing than non-white voters in this country. If you look at the Democratic Party and you look at the breakdown, either a majority or certainly a disproportionate number of the conservative and moderate Democrats are non-white.
Right.
And the progressives in the Democratic Party are disproportionately, overwhelmingly the white Democrats.
Right. And what percentage of the African American community do you think is in favor of drag queen story hour for children? These are like these elite
African Americans in particular are socially conservative.
Right.
So we know that they are not on board with a lot of this agenda. They were not on board with gay marriage, 10 years ago, and that was a major issue. But again, those individuals don't have the voice in our media, in our culture. They don't have the tenured professorships. They don't have the columns at the major newspapers. You're starting to see new voices emerge, podcasts, Substack, and whatnot. I mean, there's a very kind of it's a real sort of democratic moment in media now. It's an almost revolutionary moment, and we're seeing the kind of breakdown in authority, I think, which is a huge part of this, and that the institutions of authority in this country, from the universities to the CIA to the FBI to the foundations to the establishment media to the CDC, I mean, all these institutions have basically, Americans are losing trust in them, which I think is a very worrying trend. Not that I think that it's not deserved in many cases, but it's a worrying trend when the American people don't really trust anything anymore. That can make it easy for conspiracy theories to spread, and it's hard basically to have a cohesive society. But there is a silver lining to it, and I think in that we are seeing the growth of new voices in the media, and people are becoming more skeptical perhaps of what they hear. They're more open to alternative points of view. Sorry, I'm just kind of going.
Yeah, no. I like what you said about. So this is one of the things I always sort of joke about was I almost have more respect for and I'm as anti-communist as you can get, but at least I never even thought I would premise a sort of question with at least the communists, but they had, like you said, and the socialists as well. We can maybe focus on them a bit more, although those terms were traditionally used interchangeably, but they had a cohesive sort of multi-ethnic program where if you were born with certain immutable characteristics, like it didn't really matter as long as you sort of bought into the economic arguments. And that and I completely agree that if there were a traditional pro-labor, pro-working man party that sort of appealed to your, GM worker and your electricians and plumbers and this and that, or people who are on the working class, who are whites or of multiple races, that would be a very much winning coalition.
Well, I mean,
dropping
the
the
problem
race
is,
stuff.
Trump tried that, but he had
Right.
all his baggage. He had his racist, in my opinion, racist dog whistling and authoritarian instincts. I mean, so Trump, tried to do that, but clearly did not accomplish it, and he's too compromised. And the left is sort of trying to do it too, but they are sort of the mirror image of Trump in this sense on all the same sort of issues when it comes to wokeness, right? And so,
Right. Well, they're not even trying though. The left, because race is be all end all right now for them.
Well, I'm
right?
saying there are voices on the left making this case.
Okay.
Michael Lind, who's a fellow writer at Tablet Magazine, I've been really recommend him to your writers. He's a sorry to your listeners. He's a fascinating writer, very deeply knowledgeable, intellectual, and he wrote 2 pieces recently where he said, "Here's the winning plan for the Democrats," and then he did another one, the winning plan for the Republicans, and he basically goes through and he makes the kind of argument that I just sort of almost copied, basically, where he says, if the Democrats go for this more populist, colorblind policies that are widely popular, people don't want to abolish Medicare, they don't want to reduce Social Security, they want to raise the minimum wage, they like social spending, but they don't like affirmative action programs, they don't like the kind of trans radicalism, right? And then on the right, it's like, there are appealing things about the right. People do like the free market. They like entrepreneurship. They want a strong foreign policy, but they don't, they don't want a Donald Trump. They don't want a guy who's spouting conspiracy theories and racial dogs. So he makes an interesting case, and I think he's right. And I might not agree with that. I might not agree with everything on the agenda of that sort of, ideal political party that Michael Lind has. But I think we could have a more rational debate in this country.
Absolutely.
If such a party existed, or if the Democrats and the Republicans both listened to him and fought over these issues, as opposed to the kind of gestural, symbolic issues that really don't affect people's pocketbook. I mean, trans bathrooms or defunding the police. I mean, these are such faculty lounge things. I mean, it's like faculty lounge / Tucker Carlson issues. Like, they're both like they start in the faculty lounge, right, and then the right wing loves to go on and on and on about them, but they're not. Most Americans are not being confronted with this stuff, I think, yet. And I think it's all a large distraction from the real stuff we have to deal with, which China is a huge is going to be the 21st century generational struggle that we thought Islamic terrorism was after 9/11. I think the further we move away from 9/11, actually, I think the less epical in terms of America it seems. It doesn't seem that America changed that much because of 9/11. I think other parts of the world did, the Middle East, obviously, but America itself has not changed as much as I think that we thought it would because of 9/11. I think China has sort of overtaken that in the kind of the grand strategic picture. Anyways, this is all a diversion from the point that this is what we should be talking about, China. And not a lot of these kind of cultural war squabbles that we seem to get into all the time.
I want to talk about a couple things that you mentioned. Sort of, I think one of the best encapsulations of the sort of modern left, and that basically diverting away from what the core of what the left used to be, was found in the most recent British election with Jeremy Corbyn, where places that were traditional labor strongholds hadn't voted conservative in decades, in some cases almost centuries.
Or ever. There was
ever. That's right.
Always voted for the Labour Party.
And they all voted, and they voted for it. It wasn't like Boris Johnson was some sort of like Ronald Reagan incarnate. He was not charismatic. He was not a special politician.
Boris is very charismatic. He was not a right-wing Tory, that's for sure. He's what they call a one nation. He's a one nation Tory, and that he's more, and he's spending a lot of money. Actually, I mean, it's massive social spending in Britain right now.
He wouldn't be, I would say, someone of so Reagan won 49 out of 50 states. I'm talking about that level
Oh, I see what you mean.
of just
Yeah,
force
yeah,
of personality, charisma, and all that.
right.
You know, so and he still, you know, just cleaned the clock of the Labor Party, and there's more so a vote against the Jeremy Corbyns of the world to
Yeah,
represent this you know,
yeah,
a faculty lounge like sociology professor type of
yeah,
agenda, to the exclusion of the things people actually care about. With respect to the sort of the Tucker Carlson conservative reaction, you know, I almost feel like, for example, someone like me, I couldn't have cared less about sort of trans issues. That's not something I, you know, that's like in a top 10
yeah,
sorts of ideas or theories or things I like to think about. But when and and this goes to the whole takeover of all these liberal and traditional, you know, maybe apolitical institutions by the sort of woke left, is like they almost force you to have
yeah,
a a a counter response and focus on those issues, because it's like they're taking power away. They're getting their tentacles in every single aspect of society. And so when it went from, you know, well, let's be respectful to trans people and, you know, treat them like any other human being, to no, they have to, you know, you have, here's, for example, going to the ACLU in a second. ACLU
yeah,
is now opposing in court Loudoun County teachers who say that they don't want to be compelled to speak. So
yeah.
ACLU is trying to compel people to speak, trying to compel people to use a certain pronouns that, you know, the students, certain trans students want. So I mean, it's like, how you have to talk about this stuff. You have to talk
Mhm.
about, like, you know, drag queen, you know, story hour in your child's school, and I think, like, even though you want to focus
Mm,
on the, so how, you
yeah.
know, what do you make about that? How do you renounce
Well, I
that?
do think the kind of culture war now is largely being prosecuted by the left. Yes,
Mhm.
um, but I worry about a sort of right wing overreaction. Um, in that, I think some of these laws, perhaps banning critical race theory. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I would need to look into that more because I
Mhm.
tend to be, you know, as you know, pretty pluralist and supporter of free speech. Whether or not I think it depends on each individual example, but we are seeing cases where these local school boards are going too far, and they're sort of conflating what we would consider normal educational materials about civil rights history. They're
Right.
conflating that with sort of critical race theory and like Angela Davis, right? So they're kind
Mhm.
of, I think there was one school district that, you know, banned the reading of the memoir by Ruby Dee, who was one of the first Black children to integrate a Southern school, which should be taught in schools. That's being conflated with, say, some of the you know, Ibram X Kendi or
Mhm.
whatnot.
Mhm.
Um, but yes, I mean, I'm constantly frustrated by a lot of these sort of overreaches by progressives, because I don't think they understand that they are creating Donald Trump supporters every day.
Mhm.
Because, you know, most, or not most, a lot of people in this country don't sit and think and watch politics all the time, and they're not, say, very nuanced, which I don't blame them because they have more important things to do. And so, you know, they just hear kind of in the ambient noise all these things that you're mentioning, and they say, you know, this is ridiculous, enough of this. And, you know, if Trump's the guy who's going to stop it, then I'm going to go with Trump.
Mhm.
And that happens. That's
Right.
happening. It's happened. I've seen it in people that I know who started out not liking Trump or actively hostile to him or um, maybe neutral, and then now are basically full on board because they've just
Mhm.
been driven over the edge. Um, and it just seems to me that it's this negative polarization going back and forth, and that it's very difficult to remain in the center liberal ground.
Right.
Certainly in media, certainly in academia, there's hardly any diversity left in academia, um, and in politics too. I mean, we're increasingly seeing you know, there are hardly any centrist or liberal Republicans, or they're being driven out, and there are very few conservative Democrats. And this is a long-term trend. I mean, this goes
Mhm.
back, you know, 20, 30 years, you could say, that the parties have become more ideologically, you know, mono in that sense.
Mhm. Where did this sort of this how do you trace it back, this sort of takeover left to focus on these pet upper class elite issues like transgenderism and race at all costs and things like that? Where's that? Is that like a because of postmodernism taught in the academic institutions and then coming its way down? Like, what do you make of the sort of that transition of party a political philosophy that used to be dominated
Yeah.
by you know Alan Dershowitz types and people of that
Mhm.
nature who were like, these are the people I grew up around in LA. I'm a someone who's on the right wing of many issues,
Mm.
but these were the kinds of liberals where they would have an American flag outside their home. They would be the first ones to say, screw you. I love America just as you. I just think X,
Yeah.
Y, and Z. I just think
Right.
that we need a bigger welfare state, this and that. And those people sort of dying off and being replaced by the
Right.
Ibrahim X Kendis. Where's that come from? Like, how did that happen?
Well, I think part of it has to do with the decline is economic. And again, I don't want to sound too much, like a Marxist, but I think a lot of it has to do with the decline in manufacturing in
Hmm.
this country and sort of the decline of labor unions. If you look at the percentage of Americans who belonged to a labor union in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, it's been on a steady decline. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but
Right.
it's
Yeah.
very small. I think it's probably
Right.
like 11%.
I think it was over
Um,
50% at one point, right? Or in the
Yes, and by the
workforce.
way,
Yeah.
it's much smaller in the private sector. I mean, you
Hmm.
have all government employees are unionized, but they have different interests, okay, than the private sector
Right.
ones. And private sector unionization has gone down, which is also a part of the fact of the decline of the manufacturing sector. And so that whole wing of the Democratic Party, the kind of union wing, which by
Hmm.
the way was the more in some senses was the more on some issues, importantly, was the more conservative wing.
Hmm.
It was very anti-communist. It was
Hmm.
actually the most anti-communist, one of the most anti-communist sectors of American society was the AFL-CIO,
Hmm.
strongly supportive of the Vietnam War, and strongly supportive in the 1980s of the Solidarity Union in Poland, and very supportive of anti-communist activities abroad. Right, so that's the American labor movement, and that doesn't really exist anymore. And in fact, I saw I think yesterday, the AFL-CIO, came out in favor of the walkout at Netflix over
Oh
Dave
God.
Chappelle's
Oh my
comedy
God.
special. I mean, I would actually really love to see a poll of
Right. Right.
AFL-CIO members,
Yeah.
okay, mine workers,
Right.
steel workers, food production people. I would really be curious to see what their views
Mhm.
are on the issues that Dave Chappelle is being attacked about. I would suspect that the membership is probably not behind the leadership on this issue. I think that so. I think that's a huge part of it. I think it's sort of structural and economic,
Mhm.
in that um, we have a more knowledge-based economy, and the working class is, it's now in this other economy, right? Where it's what do they call it? The
The
where
gig
you're driving an
economy.
Uber,
Yeah.
the gig economy, right? That's replacing, good unionized jobs.
Hmm.
So that's a large part of it. I think we also have basically we're seeing the fruits of 50 years of the kind of progressive march through the institutions of academia, and we just have a new generation of younger people arising out of these institutions who think that liberalism, traditional liberalism, is basically a mask for oppression,
Right.
that free speech is a tool that the powerful use to
Hmm.
oppress the powerless, that color blindness, which was what Martin Luther King
Right.
supported, that color blindness is just another form of racism,
Hmm.
that due process needs to be replaced by people's justice,
Yeah. Believe all women.
um, and we're seeing the results of this. And I think the George Floyd incident just played a huge role in accelerating these changes that had already been going on for some time. But I think Trump and Floyd. I think Trump radicalized people in the opposite direction.
Hmm.
They sort of took to heart the belief that he was an actual fascist, imposing fascism on the United States, and there were lots of university professors and so-called experts who were willing to validate these heroic fantasies that they had. They were
Right.
fighting fascism. And let's be honest, like if you're going to fight fascism, you got to do more than wear a pussy hat, right? Like that's not fighting. That's not how they got rid of Hitler.
Right. I don't think they know what fascism means. At least.
Well, but they've
like,
sort of deluded themselves into
Yeah.
thinking this, and so sort of
Right.
anything goes in that kind of, right. So there's no enemies to the left.
Right.
No enemy. It's a kind of no enemies to the left attitude, which, by the way, was the attitude that some Arthur Schlesinger called them dough-faced liberals during the Cold War. Were basically, you know, they were anti-communists. They weren't communists themselves, but they were willing to make common cause with communists, or sort of willing to overlook the depredations of communism because they believed in kind of a popular front. And that may have made sense during World War II when you were actually fighting fascism, but you know, not in 1950s America. And so, yeah, I find there are lots of similarities between 1950s America, which I'm writing a book that has a lot about this, but it's sort of a similar ideological landscape where, you know, we do have a far right in this country that is absolutely bonkers, in my opinion. They just don't have much cultural power, but they are influential.
Not basically, right? I mean,
huh?
They have no. I mean, what cultural?
They don't
power
have cultural. They don't have cultural.
They
don't have cultural power and influence, but they are. I'm sorry. They don't have. They don't have the same cultural influence as the woke left does, but they are. I mean, Donald Trump may yet again be the nominee of the Republican Party, so let's not delude ourselves into thinking that they're not out there. So, but we do have this kind of far right that's a problem, and we do have this, far left that is a problem, and that, I don't like making Nazi communist analogies. I think they're sort of lazy, but there are similarities. There are a lot of similarities in their ideology and Marxism, and frankly, the way they behave. I mean, if you look at the institutions that they control, which is pretty much academia. Academia is sort of most, I think, where they have the biggest lock on power. If you look at the way they behave, they behave like petty tyrants in a communist society.
Right.
I mean, what's happening at Yale Law School? I'm a Yale grad. I mean, what's happening at Yale Law School, which I'm assuming you've been following, and your listeners should look into, with this student who wrote an email that some other students called racist, and he was brought into if you listen to the tape, he's brought into a meeting with Yale administrators, and they're basically giving him a forced confession to sign, as if he was this was like the Cultural Revolution.
The language at issue was something to do with a party.
He used the term trap house. He was
trap
inviting,
house, right. Yeah.
He's a Native American kid, so he's of color,
right.
But he's also a member of the Federalist Society, which is a conservative legal group.
Issue. Yeah.
And he used the word, and he was inviting people to a party at his own house, which he referred to as a trap house, which is a term for like a drug den or something. So he's being kind of self-deprecating.
Right.
But if you actually listen to the, diversity dean at Yale, he actually says, this was very racially inflammatory, but the fact that you are a minority does complicate this and could help you.
Oh my God.
And I mean, so it's this kind of give and take, and it's extremely disturbing to hear this, because it basically confirms all your worst fears about what these administrators think and the way that they behave. And this is, I would say, is maybe the third answer to your question, is that we've seen this rise of a certain class of people. They're kind of administrators. They're human resources administrators in corporations, and at universities they are sort of diversity deans, or they're not PhD faculty. Okay, these aren't people who are teaching. And if you look at the size of this class of people, these administrators have ballooned.
Thousands of percent. Yeah, since
and they need to justify their existence. And the way you do that is by creating controversies, right? So, because if there's no racial or gender or sexual orientation controversies on campuses and in workplaces, then there's no reason for these people to have jobs. So they have to constantly be on the lookout, searching, keeping their eyes peeled for infractions of standards and rules that were created yesterday, right? I mean, who knew that you weren't allowed to address someone by this particular pronoun, right? Or who knew you weren't allowed to use this word? Or who knew that there weren't two genders, and to say otherwise was a hate crime? I mean, these things are constantly being invented. And it's become, and this goes back to the class issue, is this has become a way for this new class to basically insulate itself, in that, if you don't speak this lingo and this language, and you don't know what Latinx means, or Latinx, I still don't know how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm apparently in league with 96% of Hispanics who either oppose or have never heard of this term before. Okay,
Right.
But if you create this sort of abstruse language, this very arcane vernacular, that you have to go to a certain, not just university, you have to have gone to basically one of 500 universities to even know how to speak this language, then you basically put up a giant moat around yourself, protecting you and your kind from anyone else from joining your class. And again, I go back to these old school lefties who are pissed about this because it is the exact opposite of what the left is supposed to be about, which is working class solidarity. And you're not supposed to smugly talk down to people and call them racists and bigots because they don't know that there are 597 genders.
Can you go over, succinctly, so what you wrote about sort of the ACLU, and I know we can have an entire whole different podcast discussion just about them, but I think it's really important. ACLU is one of the most influential organizations, I would say, basically since they've been around since right after World War I, but really like in that sort of 60s and on up, they became this real powerhouse of an organization. Tens of millions of dollars raised, probably even hundreds if you go through the decades. And what they traditionally would stand for under a sort of traditional working class, blue collar type liberal like Glaser, who ran it, and what they are now with this Romero individual who was, I guess, you worked in the Ford Foundation before, which is just like, I remember seeing the emails that came out recently with the whole Ford Foundation listserv. It was literally the exact same thing as the kinds of crap you'd see in student government, with like, and they're stupid 20-year-olds, like speaking this nonsense. Oh, you can't say old guys, do you use gender neutral language, like, and you're creating violence against trans people by saying old guys, stuff like that. And here you have this Ford Foundation literally echoing those same sorts of assertions, and these are supposed to be intellectuals, but like, what, using sort of the ACLU as an example, can you sort of go through that change? Because I think they're very symbolic of this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, the ACLU was founded in 1919, I believe, during the first Red Scare, which was when you had the government persecuting anarchists, leftists, socialists, anti-war activists, locking them up in jail for their political views, shutting down newspapers. I mean, real fascistic behavior. And the ACLU was founded to defend these individuals who had unpopular views. They were certainly unpopular. And, since that time, it grew, and it was basically was founded to defend the Constitution and constitutional rights, basic constitutional rights, regardless of politics, which is very important. And sort of the iconic case, if you really want to describe what the ACLU did, because it doesn't do this anymore, was in 1978, when there were a group of Nazis who wanted to march through a community in Illinois that had a lot of Holocaust survivors. And the town was basically using all these kind of bureaucratic tricks to prevent them from doing so, making them pay, basically using the same laws that racist Southern governments used to prevent African American civil rights marchers from marching, which is you make them pay an outrageous amount of money, for a bond in order to march, an insurance bond, before they can hold a rally somewhere. These were struck down repeatedly by the Supreme Court as violations of the First Amendment, which allows for not just free speech, but the peaceful assembly of citizens. So you have a town, which, I'm not saying that the residents of Skokie weren't, I'm not comparing them to racist Southern governments, but they were using the same arguments. And this is why this point I'm about to make is important, is because when the ACLU came to the defense of these neo-Nazis, and I interviewed Ira Glasser, who was the longtime director of the organization, he's adamant in saying we weren't defending Nazis. We were defending the First Amendment. Okay? The First Amendment, the First Amendment applies to everyone. Everyone gets the First Amendment. Doesn't matter what your political views are. You get the First Amendment. And you can't make exceptions or excuses for it. And that means African-American civil rights marchers have a right to march, and Nazis have a right to march. And if you don't like the Nazis, and I don't like Nazis, but if you try to prevent them from marching, then there's no intellectual argument that you can make, or legal argument for that matter, to prevent, George Wallace from doing the same in Alabama against Black people. And so the ACLU was, a politically neutral organization. And, were most of its members and donors probably on the left? Yeah, I would say so. But they came to the defense of anyone regardless of their politics. And they did not weigh in on issues, I think, that were outside their, ken, you could say. And then, around the early 2000s, the organization began to change. And there's a very good book about this by Wendy Kaminer. I'm forgetting the name of it, but she was on the board of the ACLU, and she documents how this process started. And gradually, the organization became basically an appendage of you could say, the progressive movement, a part of the Democratic Party, even to go so far as that, where now they're basically running ads explicitly, calling for people to vote for certain candidates. And nor are they defending, free speech rights. They're often avoiding cases like this, or in some cases, they're actually taking the anti-free speech side in arguing somehow constitutionally that speech must be compelled. And it's interesting to see that case you mentioned. They said in their defense, that trans students don't feel safe if they're not addressed by these pronouns, which is basically making the argument that speech, or in this case, the absence of certain speech, is the equivalent of violence, which is completely antithetical to the First Amendment and could be used, by the way, again, to go back to where we started this conversation. That argument was used by racist Southern governors in the South to say that speech is violence. The speech of those African-American civil rights demonstrators is the equivalent of violence. They're racial agitators. They're stirring up problems here in our nice little town where the races live, in different parts of the town, and they know how to segregate themselves from each other. These people and their speech is causing problems. It's basically the same argument that's now being made by the ACLU. It's incredible.
Even as crazy was I'm sure you saw what they basically censored and altered Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quote about women. I just want to repeat for the audience. So she had.
By the way, not the only people on the left that tried to alter RBG's statements. I mean, there's Katie Couric as well. We can talk about that.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's just even more disturbing coming from the ACLU, because this is what they're supposed to be against. And so, and one of the worst aspects of it was the fact that, so when they altered it, they changed the entire nature of her argument, because the quote in question was: the decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a woman's life, to her well-being and dignity. It's a decision she must make for herself. When the government controls that decision for her, she's being treated as less than a full adult human responsible for her own choice. So clearly the entire premise of the argument was women need the right to access abortion in order to be treated sort of equally with a man. Okay, so whatever people think about abortion, that's what she was trying to say. And ACLU alters a liberal icon's words after she's dead. The decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a person's life, not a woman's life, a person's life, to their well-being and dignity. When the government controls that decision for people, they are being treated as less than a full adult human responsible for their own choices. I mean, so it's just like to stoop to that. It's more than just, I think, censoring. It's to stoop to that level.
It's actually misogyny. It's misogyny.
Right.
Because I do believe abortion is a women's rights issue. I'm a very strong supporter of the right to have an abortion. I believe there should be limits on it, like most Americans, but I absolutely, and it's fundamental to a woman's, to women,
Right.
because if a woman can't have control over that basic function, I think that is too much control in the hands of the state. But it has to do with womanhood. It's not something that men have to deal with. Men don't get pregnant.
Right.
Sorry,
Right.
maybe I
Right.
shouldn't have said that.
Right.
But men don't get pregnant. And the fact that you have an organization like this, literally erasing women from one of the most important women's rights issues of the past 60 years, I think is really terrifying. And I think it shows that for a certain segment of the left, they see virtue as being sort of directly proportional to marginalization, right? And so the trans issue, or the trans identity, which is what this was all about, that's why they were, that's who on behalf of, that they were, the ACLU was erasing womanhood from this quote.
Right.
They thought they were doing it on behalf of trans people. I actually think most trans people don't agree with a lot of the sort of extreme arguments and campaigns that are pushed by their, so-called self-appointed spokesmen and women. I think most trans people just want to go about their lives, being left alone.
Right.
But anyway, so trans is more, women, they're half the population. And whereas, 30 or 40, 50 years ago, women were at the van, in the same way that gay men, used to be kind of the underdog in society. Now it's trans.
That used to be the sexy
marginal.
cause, right? Now trans is
trans is more marginal than women. Trans is more marginal than gay. Therefore, trans gets a higher notch on the intersectional victim pyramid. And so you see just within the kind of LGBT community, just vicious homophobia directed at gay men by trans activists.
Right.
Lying about the history of Stonewall, which was a very important moment in the history of gay rights, and claiming that it was, trans women who led that. And it's funny, the trans woman who led this protest of Dave Chappelle just came out today. She has a whole history of violently homophobic comments on Twitter, attacking gay men and Asians, by the way. They're lower on the scale now. It just shows the hypocrisy of this. And what's really driving it is not any kind of sincere concern for people's human rights and livelihood and creating a better society. It's about power. I think this really goes back to maybe what you were asking me at the very beginning is, why is this happening? And it's, people have discovered that this sort of language of wokeism, this emotional blackmail. I mean, one of the trans employees at Netflix who was attacking Chappelle and leading this, she basically had a long list of trans women of color who've been murdered over the past couple of years and blaming Dave Chappelle for each and every single one of these people's murder. And by the way, the only trans people who died as a result of this controversy with Dave Chappelle is the woman who he talks about, the trans woman who he basically dedicates this special to, his protege, whom he talks about very movingly in the last 15 minutes of this special, who was driven to suicide by other people on the internet attacking her for being friends with Dave Chappelle. That's the only trans person who lost their life as a result of any of this brouhaha about Dave Chappelle, which I think is another irony. But so none of this of what we're going through now has to do with, helping the underprivileged or, helping LGBT or helping marginalized people. It has to do with certain groups of individuals who want jobs, they want power in institutions, they want certain career, they want things and they want to get them. And they've discovered that in these institutions, using this sort of emotional blackmail, calling people out, calling them homophobes or racists or transphobes, demanding that they do the work, all this lingo in this rhetoric and language that we've been subjected to for the past 2 years, in these institutions, it works. It works because there's been extremely few examples when it doesn't work. I can probably count on one hand the number of times a university president, an editor at a major newspaper, the head of a foundation, of a nonprofit foundation, the curator of a museum has actually stood up to any of these mobs and said, no, we're not going to do it.
Netflix, it seemed like they were going to do that in the beginning, and now they backed off as well.
I'm not even. It's hard. Yeah, I mean, they started out, but again, he kind of screwed up the response. He made the wrong argument where he basically said Chappelle makes us a lot of money. What do you want me to do?
Right.
He should have made an intellectual defense.
Mm-hmm.
No, this is not transphobic. No, he's not a hate monger. He's a comedian. Lighten up. I mean, those are the sorts of arguments he should have made. He left himself open to criticism by making the kind of foolish utilitarian argument that because then it opens him up to criticism that he's sort of a greedy CEO, and that's that's basically the argument that they made.
Yeah.
But this is about power, and it's people have discovered they have some very powerful tools in their hands that work. These tools work, and why wouldn't if you're an unscrupulous person, or you've been deluded in this ideological framework into believing that it's actually righteous and just to treat people this way. Why wouldn't you use these tools to destroy people who you believe are fascists? One of the people leading this protest yesterday outside the Netflix headquarters said that trans people are suffering a Holocaust, which, as a Jew, I'm offended. Okay, but put that aside. If you use that sort of language to describe the situation right now for trans people, why wouldn't you behave this way? Why wouldn't you be trying to destroy Dave Chappelle and bring down all these institutions? If you use that sort of language day in and day out, and you work people up into a frenzy, then I think it's not a surprise that this is these are the sort of outcomes that we're getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also truly sickening. To just minimize the suffering and the death and destruction of 6 million people with Dave Chappelle making a joke trying to equate that. I think it's also interesting. I actually didn't see this bit coming. I didn't think it would happen so fast. I thought Dave Chappelle would be, and maybe he is, the last person that the sort of woke mob could go after because of his positioning as one of the most beloved, successful African Americans in U.S. society, and not only that, it's like he's not like a Clarence Thomas, conservative, what they could call an Uncle Tom kind of African American man.
No, by no means.
Right, he's what we consider maybe like a left wing.
I don't even know what his politics are.
We don't know what his politics are, but he's by no means I think everyone can agree like a conservative, Ben Carson or Clarence Thomas, and so he's been lambasted to an extent that I actually didn't see coming, because I thought he'd be one of the last. Man, maybe he's one of the last people, and now we're across that bridge as well now, and the intersectional games continue. Can you sort of just spell out as well? We mentioned sort of the being Jewish. How is this like sort of wokeism affecting a minority like the Jews, right? Like they seem to be both a target of the far right and now the far left, and like we said, the far left are the ones with the cultural cachet and power now.
Yeah.
So it's much more they're much more affected by that line of thinking, like Linda Swords and all that. Can you sort of go over like what the threat is from the far left to the Jewish community, and how that's sort of played out?
Well, basically, Jews have been redefined as white, which many of us might present that way. If I were walking down the street, I would not be stopped by a police officer in the same way that a Black person would. So to that extent, I can understand why you might consider me white. But this is a very recent sort of language that's being used. Certainly, Jews in the 1950s were not considered white by any means. And by the way, I would just add that even today, for the people who really, really care about their white identity, they don't consider Jews white either. Okay, right. By which I mean the far right. But in this new kind of left woke universe, Jews are classified as white. They're classified as privileged. And this has a lot to do with sort of stereotypes of old stereotypes of Jews, left-wing stereotypes of Jews that go back to Marx, that Jews are part of the capitalist class, that they are, or to quote Randy Weingarten, the leader of the teachers union, who is, to her everlasting shame, Jewish, and she used this term. She said Jews are part of the ownership class recently, or sometime maybe last year. She said Jews are seen as part of the ownership class. They're part of the capitalist class. This is nothing new. These are old school Marxist arguments, just in new form, but they've been racialized now, which is dangerous because in the new kind of woke language, there's a new racial hierarchy, and whiteness is seen as a form of evil, and Jews are now being associated, or they're implicated in whiteness.
Right.
In the same way that Asians are too, by the way. It's not just Jews who are facing this, but Asians as well. And it's very discomforting for American Jews because they are by and large overwhelmingly Democrats. They're liberal. But all these institutions, from Harvard University to the New York Times to you name, or to this right here in Washington D.C., the Sunrise Movement, a voting rights organization, just yesterday decided that it was not going to take part in some sort of protests regarding voting rights for D.C. because groups like the National Coalition of Jewish Women and some other left-wing Jewish groups, they said that they are not going to partake in any political activity with Zionist organizations.
Oh God!
So this is very difficult, I think, for many Jews, most American Jews, to appreciate, because they've grown up in these institutions, they've revered these institutions, they've looked up to them for moral guidance, probably more than they even have their Judaism. Okay, these institutions are more important to them than their Jewish community or their synagogue. And all of a sudden, it seems that they've been overtaken by this radical ideology that is extremely hostile to them, and that's forcing them to make a choice, which is you can either be a progressive or you can be a Zionist. You can't be both.
Right.
No other group in this country is being made to face this choice by these progressives other than Jews. Okay, there's no other group. There's no other. Pakistanis are not being made to denounce the Pakistani government, which is 100 times worse than the Israeli government. Okay, I can go through the list of ethnic subgroups in the United States. Chinese Americans are not made to answer for the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, when President Trump, made some very irresponsible comments that did seem to implicate or at least cast a shadow over our Chinese Americans, the left, went up in arms about it. Okay, when he was calling it, Kung flu and the China virus. I mean, you can disagree on his language, but I don't think it was presidential. Put it that way. But it's only Jews who are made to do this, and so that to me is the definition of anti-Semitism. When you're singling out Jews for something, just as if you're singling out any group of people for any kind of opprobrium, it's unfair. I mean, I think to deny marriage to gay people was unfair, and to deny equality to gay people was unfair, and we fixed that in this country, thankfully, through free expression, something that some of our latter-day LGBT advocates might want to understand and appreciate. We didn't get gay marriage in this country by shutting people down and shouting them down. We debated them and we won the argument. And so I think it's the same. And so I think what's happening for Jews in this country is very worrisome, because if you saw the violence that erupted earlier this year in response to the fighting in Gaza, this was the first time really in the history of the United States that we saw, sort of large scale or, violent attacks on Jews in response to directly in response to flaring up of conflict in the Middle
US.
East. In the United States. Yep. Right. This kind of anti-Semitic violence has been happening for decades in Europe.
Right.
I mean, whenever there's an issue whenever there's fighting between Israel and Palestinians, there's you see every Jewish institution in Europe go on high alert, right? They get extra bodyguards,
Right.
they close the gates.
Security of synagogues. Yep.
Yeah, that's been, and I've lived in Europe and I've written about this. That's old news. That's been going on for a long time. What was new was seeing in the United States, in your neck of the woods, was seeing, marauding gangs of Arab men in caravans of cars driving through West Hollywood,
right,
assaulting random Jews on the street outside sushi restaurants, or in the Diamond District of New York, waving Palestinian flags and just, setting upon identifiably Jewish people, and just beating them up.
Right.
That's a new thing.
Not Zionists, by the way, which is important distinction.
These people were not waving Israeli flags.
Right,
people were not waving. Okay, that if that were happening, you could say whatever. It's
still discussing, but different.
It got out of hands. This was just random violence being rained down upon innocent people just because of their Jewishness or perceived Jewishness. That's a new thing. And also new, there is now a caucus in the Democratic Party that is anti-Israel. Some of them are anti-Semitic, explicitly anti-Semitic. That's a new, and it's a growing caucus of the Democratic Party. There's a growing voice in the media, in the respectable precincts of the media, that is does not believe Israel has a right to exist. And then in academia, it just gets worse every day in academia. In higher education, the academic boycotts, the boycotts don't get approved ultimately, because because the presidents and the trustees block them. But if you just look at the kind of growing chorus on university campuses among the professoriate and among some student organizations,
Queers for Palestine's my favorite.
Yeah, Queers for Palestine, right? Yeah, also known as cows for eating hamburgers.
Right.
So yeah, I think all these trends are getting worse in this country, and America has been the greatest country for the Jews, unparalleled opportunities, and I'm not, I don't want to sound the alarm and say that things are coming crashing down and everyone should, pack their bags and move to Israel. I'm not saying that by any means. But if you look at these sectors that I've just mentioned, they all seem to be getting worse, in my opinion. But interestingly, what I think is interesting here is that Israel's position in the world is getting stronger. If you just look at the peace accords that they're striking with Arab governments, these things were inconceivable years ago. Absolutely. African governments that ended their diplomatic relationships with Israel in the 1960s and 70s are now becoming Israeli allies.
Trump certainly gets credit for that.
China. Huh?
Trump certainly gets credit for that.
He does. I do give him some credit for that, absolutely. And so it's this weird kind of juxtaposition where I think American Jews always, we're always very supportive of Israel, but always sort of, in a way, almost look down on Israelis, thinking, we got it better here in America, and the notion that we would ever have to move to Israel is, that's silly. We'll never have to do that. And now it's this weird situation where Israel is actually stronger than it's ever been, economically, strategically, but the American Jewish community feels under siege in a way it's never felt before. But I am sort of reassured in the sense that I think Israel can withstand this, because I don't think that any of these Western movements, the BDS movement, these attempts to delegitimize Israel on the international stage are clearly not working. They're not working. But it's almost like an inverse relationship. Sort of the more powerful or the safer and stronger Israel is becoming as a state, the more intense the hatred and the activity of these organizations in the West is becoming.
I think that's a good point. One of the reasons why I brought it up, and I think it's important not just for people who are concerned about the Israel issue in particular, or the rise of anti-Semitism, although it's certainly an issue and always leads to worse outcomes as we've seen in history. the Israel issue is very much the dividing line. It's one of the best sort of Rorschach tests that you can have between what is traditional liberal, like the Democrat liberal, versus
Yeah.
the woke left, right? Because it's like any sort of semblance of liberalism, if you the people who bought into the ideology throughout time, but like, okay, this is one of the most pro LGBT places in the world, particularly in the Middle East, by far. It's not even close. This is a place with a rule of law, with the most rights for women in their entire region by far, not even close. I mean, all sorts of civil rights issues, they're like A plus relative to their neighbors. And by the way, the people who are fighting against them are, the most backwards that you can get in modern times in terms of these issues that that the left supposedly really cares about, like gay rights and women's rights and liberation for minorities and all that. And yet there will still be some those people who buy into the woke left narrative consider Israel to be one of the worst regimes in the world, or even equate them to Nazism. Whereas the people who, and like we said with the queers in Palestine, it's like they'll literally want to kill you. If you don't believe me, like go to the West Bank and like have two dudes make out and see what happens to them, right? And that's the side that they picked. And I think more so than almost anything in the world, that really encapsulates the sort of logical fallacy of their entire ideology and belief system.
Yeah, and I mean, it wasn't always this way. I mean, it used to be that the left was extremely supportive of Israel. Partly at first because it was the Soviet Union supported Israel, but well after that, well after the Soviet Union sided with the Arabs in the 50s and 60s, you had very strong support from socialist parties across Europe and from the left in this country. It started to change after the Six-Day War, when Israel came into possession of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the perception began to change that Israel was no longer this sort of righteous victim, but Israel was now the bully.
Right.
And I mean, there is something to the argument, obviously, that once Israel came into possession of these territories and was, ruling over Palestinians in the way it hadn't been before, certainly the nature of the country changed, and the settlements has absolutely changed the nature of Israel as a country. And I think that's something that we have to grapple with, and Israel will have to resolve one way or another. But the arguments that, the argument that it could just, create a Palestinian state tomorrow, and that this would somehow be a better situation than the status quo, and that all the cards lie in Israel's hands.
Yeah, right.
I don't think that that's a realistic or legitimate.
And also the racial element that they try to insert into this, where they try to make the Jews into white people and the Palestinians into brown people. Try and frame that way. Last thing I want to ask you about was, what are you we have a little bit of a a lot of things that we discussed which are concerning and all that. But what sort of gives you most hope in terms of the future, in terms of reversing some of these trends? And the pendulum always swings. So what do you see happening?
To go back to Dave Chappelle, the Rotten Tomatoes rankings, if you look at the difference between the critics and the audience, the latest special, which by the way, I don't think Dave Chappelle's latest special was actually that funny. I think his previous specials were much better. This last one I didn't find particularly funny. That aside, he needs to be defended, and this is almost, it's become a larger issue about whether it was funny.
Right.
It got something like 93 or 94% approval from audience, from normal people, versus something like 40% of the critics, right? And so, and I think we see this increasingly. We see this elite disconnect on so many issues, on so many things.
Right.
The
Fauci one as well.
The Fauci one was the opposite, where the critics loved
97 and 2, yeah.
Right. By the way, shouldn't he be using test tubes to solve science stuff? It seems he's always on television,
right,
being subject to documentaries. I mentioned earlier, the use of the word Latinx, which the vast majority of actual Latino people, maybe it has to do with the fact that Spanish is a language that is gendered, along with many other languages.
Right.
They don't use that term. Okay, but you would read, if you read academic papers or our major newspapers or listen to NPR, they persist in using this term Latinx. Just like they persist in citing the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a scam of an organization that slanders people and has tens of millions of dollars stashed away in Cayman Islands bank accounts. They are still referred to and cited as a trusted authority on hate in the United States. And you see this every day, and there's just this kind of disconnect between this kind of progressive elite that runs all these institutions and the actual people. And so I guess that kind of gives me hope. It makes me realize that this can't go on forever. Something's going to have to happen. I think a lot of these institutions are probably rotten forever. Like, I don't think in my lifetime we will see the ACLU revert back to its traditional noble goals. I think these institutions have been taken over, but we're seeing new institutions arise, perhaps, the rise of Substack and podcasting. I still have, these are the things that give me hope. I mean, it's if you were to kind of sit and just, read a handful of newspapers and watch a handful of movies and, follow a certain number of people on Twitter, you would think that this world is going to hell. But it doesn't seem that these ideas and these tactics have really sort of trickled down to the masses. I mean, they haven't succeeded.
Right.
These people haven't, these people that we've been talking about have not succeeded in winning over the large portion of this country or anything approaching a majority. They haven't persuaded them because they're not trying to persuade. That's the thing.
Right. Absolutely.
They're not trying to persuade. They're just trying to emotionally blackmail, to terrify people, to scare them. And that doesn't work. That just leads to resentment. I mean, people don't like being treated this way. They don't like the feeling that they have to go around on, tiptoes, on tenterhooks, right? Because they're in fear that they're going to use the wrong pronoun and their life and their career will be over. People don't like that. It's not normal. It's not the way we should be behaving in a free society. So I have to think that these tactics will ultimately fail, or they will lead people to create alternative institutions.
I think that's the key for sure, is alternative institutions. And if there's any indication, if you look at like CNN's ratings versus people like Joe Rogan and all sorts of different people, where forget about what you think about some of these individuals who are on the podcast or in the alternate forms of media. Like, even when you don't agree with them, they talk about substantive stuff. They don't talk about like Gabby Petito 24/7. Like even when they're not abiding by or trying to propagandize people, they're talking about nonsense like that no one cares about, and all the energy and all the interesting discussions, even when you don't agree with some of these people, like Glenn Greenwald, for example, who I'm a big fan of. I never thought I would be, but I am. They're interesting discussions. They're substantive. Stuff you talk about is substantive. It's interesting. You'll never hear that crap on CNN. So I think that's definitely the key. Well, Jamie, thanks so much. I mean, that was a really fascinating discussion. Where can people find you?
Well, I have a website, which is just jameskirchick.com. I don't update it that frequently. I will start changing that soon. I'm intermittently on Twitter, just JKirchick. For now, there's some big things coming up next year, but for now, that's where to find me.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.
We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.